Welcome, everyone. My name's DJ Wells, and you've joined us once again for our Coping with COVID webinar series, where each week we talk about those things that are happening in the world that can be tied back to the COVID pandemic and ways that we can overcome some of the problems that this pandemic is causing. Last week, Dr. Mensah and I covered a lot of great questions that many of you were asking, and so we want to kind of continue that conversation, but we also want to bring in a friend of the show, someone who's been with us before, Dr. Perry Passaro out in California, who shared some really interesting insights with us and just some casual conversations over the last couple of weeks. And so we want to kind of bring that casual conversation to you today. Right before we signed on, Dr. Passaro said, if this is going to be casual, it's going to be Perry and Albert and DJ, and so that's what we're going to do. But we encourage all of you to be part of this conversation as well. And so as you have questions or comments that you want to bring to the discussion, please do at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer, at the top of your screen if you're on an iPad or a phone. Click the Q&A tab, type in your questions, and we'll try and integrate what you send to us into the conversation. And so with that, let me hand this off to Dr. Mensah. Dr. Mensah, as always, welcome, and we'll let you take it away here.
Thank you, Mr. Wells. Dr. Passaro, aka Perry. Glad to have this conversation. And really today, that's what we're looking at here, which is having a real conversation about everything that's really kind of going on here and what sort of some of the underlying challenges are. Because right now we're mired in politics, we're mired in emotionality, we're mired in rage, we're mired in pestilence, we're mired in fires and things crossing all over the United States of America. And in many ways, each is reflective of many of the other pieces. But Perry, when we were talking, and I sent you sort of a message, a link to an article, and you produced a wonderful piece that it took me somewhere positive. And in that conversation that you put together, sprung a conversation that you and I had. And I said, Perry, that's something that really I think a lot of people should hear. So while there's hardly any way on God's green earth that we're going to reproduce that conversation, I think there's some very important pieces that come up. And Mr. Wells, do we have a copy of that? Or Perry, do you have a copy of what you wrote handy by any chance?
Well, I think, DJ did a really good job kind of summarizing it in the Mensah newsletter this morning. So I think there's a pretty good summary of what I tried to say there.
Okay. So then what I'm going to ask you to do, Perry, is you put it so eloquently, sort of the underlying, almost bottom line cause of much of what is going on. And it's really just one word. And Perry, I'd like you to share with everyone what that one word is and how we kind of go about really kind of coping with this.
Sure. So the word is fear. And when we're really honest with ourselves, no matter what side of the political divide we're on, there's fear. If you're progressive, there's fear about climate change. There's fear about systemic racism. If you're on a more conservative side, there's other things that you're fearing: law and order, the economy. So there's always these fears that are really driving our behaviors. And by evolution, by design, we're set to operate from fear. And that's really what we're doing. And we're programmed to do that easily. And now through social media and through the way news is presented to us and the way that people specifically target our fears, then it exacerbates the fears. So I can give a little example that I think might be helpful. During the midterm elections, I was doing door-to-door campaigning for someone that was running for Congress here in my district. And I went to the door, and the guy came to the door, and so I said, yeah, I'm here to talk to you about this candidate. And he said, oh yeah, I don't want to talk about him. I'm not interested. I'm gonna go the other way. And so I asked him the question, instead of just saying, okay, sorry to bother you. And I could see he was really intense. And I said, could you tell me what it is you're afraid of?
Mm.
And he immediately said to me, I'm afraid of the border. I'm afraid of immigration. I'm afraid of criminals and drug addicts and rapists coming across the border. And in California, we have a lot of people that do the real work of the world that are from Mexico and Central and South America. And so when I was talking to him from his front door, there were two gentlemen mowing his lawn and doing his yard work. And I said, you mean like these two guys here? And he goes, oh no, these guys are great. And when I had been walking up the lawn, I said something to them, and they didn't really speak much English. I said, do you think these guys are even legal? No, they're probably not, but they're good guys, and I want them to be, okay here, and, they're fine. And so what you see then is the fear that was there, but then when we don't respond with the same fear, when we don't respond with this, oh, well, you're just a bad person because you think this way, then you can get to their humanity. And so that's what we have to always be working for. When we can understand when we're talking to people and they're operating from, as you could speak to much better than me, Albert, they're operating from a lower area of consciousness and a lower area of brain functioning. And when we can not go on the attack against them, when we can be in a place of compassion and understanding and acceptance that, hey, they're being driven by fear and we're never at our best, then we can begin to see them as equals, as humans who have the same concerns as us. And when we can really transform this, it's getting to this idea that everyone is right, but partially, as opposed to thinking I'm right and you're wrong. And that's what the society has unfortunately become. It's fed in to our most primitive wiring, which is black and white, all or nothing, good and evil. And unfortunately, it's very easy to feed into that. And unfortunately, the people who know that have been targeting us to do just that.
And isn't that what traditionally in history, throughout history, has been used to cultivate domination, has been used to cultivate manipulation, has been used to cultivate control? It's always been planting the seeds of fear. And Perry, you said something that kind of triggered a thought here. So when we operate from a place of fear, and you mentioned the brain, it took me to the place of the brainstem, which is part of what many people call, let's just call it a primitive reflex area. It's an area of automaticity. It involves no higher functioning at all. So when we stoke fear and we operate from fear, we're really we're really operating at a subhuman level. We're not operating as the Homo sapiens that we are. We're really operating less than Cro-Magnon man, less than Neanderthal, not even Homo habilis. So we go back to anthropology here, way back when. The little primitive, what we called hominids, less than 4 feet tall, the first humans. Now, we sit back, supposedly, as educated, aware, more finely tuned individuals in so-called Western culture, as opposed to the primitives that we see in other areas, or at least that's what we think they are, not realizing how incredibly in tune and balanced they are with their own environment, which puts them at a much better level. But in operating from these places, we're not even operating like the wise beings, the Homo sapiens, that we claim that we are structurally designed to be. We move into very basic survival mode. And in basic survival mode, there really is little room for conscious thought. And here's the scary part. I shouldn't say where's the fire, because there is a fire now, but in terms of our everyday decision making, we cannot afford to simply draw a blank and revert to that. That's why we have higher brain functioning, to do exactly what you said. Wait a minute, let's think about this. You and I can start a conversation. You and I can actually start an argument. Let's just call it denotatively an argument. Not yelling or screaming, but you have one opinion, I have another. Difference of opinion, argument. And in the means of having an open mind, I was talking to a young collegiate today, and she said to me, you know, when people have at least a mind to listen, they're in danger of actually learning something. And what if in that conversation of just listening, and I can have my perspective, you can have your perspective, but if we listen to each other, then we may say by the time the conversation is over, well, I still hold my opinion and you still hold your opinion. We go home, but our brains are still churning. And our brains are starting to review the conversations that we had. And I might pick up the phone the next day or even 2 days or 3 days later and say to you, you know, Perry, I was thinking about what you said on that one issue. And I think it makes a whole lot of sense. You know, I kind of rethought that. And from that place, we move into an entirely different sphere of interaction. It's, gosh, you know, that Perry had a great point. And he's really a smart guy. You know, we got to talk to Perry a little bit more here because he's offered some insight into a few things. Okay. But while we are busy reacting instead of thinking, we move into a totally different space that is just horrific. And, you know, I just want to make it clear from a political perspective, you know, we've been in favor of all sides of the political spectrum. We've been in favor in the past of Democrats. We've been in the favor of Republicans. We've been in the favor of, in actuality, who is the best candidate? Who is the best person for the job? It doesn't matter one way or the other. I mean, if they align with our thoughts here, but I've seen situations where one candidate was just so horrific in terms of an inability to put together a good discussion as far as their beliefs and what their system would be, that we just said, well, you know, this person can't run the country. That's just not going to happen. And it's the other side, the other candidate. But when we're mired in fear, when we're rooted in distress, when we sit there, we kind of forget everything that's going on around us about the capacity for somebody to wield truth, the capacity for somebody to wield honesty, the capacity for someone to take care of us. We have to really start thinking there is not simply one issue that defines appropriate leadership. You're never going to find somebody who agrees with you or wants to do for you 100% of what you want. And you can't let one simple issue define your choice either. Because if you've got that one issue in theory, but the world falls apart around you, then what's actually going to be shaping your world? There'll be very little. And then that one issue you were so concerned about fades into the black. Okay. And I did something interesting the other day, Perry. I sat back and I actually watched videos of speeches from some of our past leadership throughout history, some of the great leaders. And I chuckled because there was one leader that I was so ticked off about because I felt he felt short of my expectations after he took office and when he took office. And I sat there and I listened and I said, gosh, what an awesome leader you were. When we look at what his principles were and the principles around a lot of the folks who surrounded him. And they took care of the country. They took care of the people. When we're in a divisive state, And we try to claim that that's how you move forward. It's a recipe for destruction. You know, we talked about the preamble of the Constitution a long time ago, and you and I, Perry, actually, and we talked about not we, the divided people of America. It was we, the unified people of America, in order to form a more perfect union. And I think people forget the preamble describes an ongoing process in order to form the perfect union, not we have formed the perfect union, which means that there is still the ongoing active need to do better, to take us further, and to create perhaps not what the United States was or has been, but the true vision of what an amazing unified country should be. These are very different things. You said something fabulous, Perry, and I want you to go back there. You talked about the original creation of this country, for whom it was created, and what it was really about. Perry, would you please share with us?
Well, you know, it's like Winston Churchill said, you know, I intend for history to be kind to me because I'm going to write it. And it's always the winners that write the history books. And so if, you know, and I know there's a lot of controversy, you know, based upon, you know, the work that the New York Times has done. I know the president has recently come out and said that the public schools are indoctrinating, you know, our children with propaganda about problems within the country and that we should be focused on only positive things. But again, you know, this is always appealing to the lower areas of ourself, that we understand morally, we understand it physically, we can see it, we understand it verbally, and we also understand it neurologically. We can see this when people are in imaging studies, what part of their brain is really being activated in different states. And it's what therapy tries to do, is to move you out of that state, to move you to a higher state, to be aware that you're in this lower state and to give you tools to move out of it. But if we come to the facts, which are really something that don't seem to really be all that effective currently. And of course, they're not effective because of where we're operating from. This is why we don't listen to facts anymore. But the facts of the case are very clear, that this country was founded upon the principle that the people who will have the rights are the white landowners. Those are the people that have the rights. There's no arguing that. The facts are indisputable. That's who the country was built for and around. Now, people can say that that's not true. They can say that it's a negative view, but we have to be able to be a place in this country where we can say, okay, that's how it was. And so it's not about staying stuck there. It's about how do we move from that? How do we move? As opposed to being stuck in an argument about, no, that's not how it was. That's like saying that the Civil War ultimately wasn't about slavery. Of course it was. The facts are overwhelmingly clear about that. But again, we're in this place where facts are not as relevant. And in traditional cognitive therapy, that's how you're trying to change people, is you're trying to get them to look at the facts as opposed to what their emotional mind is telling them is the truth. And that can be something like them, you know, I'm no good. That's a feeling, but it's not a fact. And so we're really trying to get them out of emotion and into higher cognition. And it's really the antidote for our society. And, you know, elevating our consciousness, elevating the areas of the brain that we're working from, being able to really have a conversation with each other, as opposed to being in this animalistic thing that you see when you watch the evening news. And again, it's all being played off and fed, both within the country and from outside the country, because what better way to destroy a superpower than from within?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It's way easier. It's way easier.
If I can add something to this conversation here. I've had several conversations recently, including conversations with you, Albert, but with members of my family. Some, um, and I'll own up to the fact that I probably lean more progressive, but there are people within my family that lean more conservative. Um, and we've had good, honest conversations about the fact that what has happened in this country is that we've moved away from true diplomacy and politics. Um, the political system used to be about, okay, you have your ideas on how to fix this problem. We have our ideas on how to fix this problem. Let's come together. Let's have a conversation. Let's figure out some place in the middle that truly meets the needs of the most people. Whereas in recent years, probably since about the 1960s, we've moved instead to a place of my side has to win 100%. And not only does my side have to win, but your side has to lose. We've moved to a place of all or nothing, and thereby we've engendered that fear. We've become that much more tribal. We've become less able to find the answers in the middle that truly do serve the interests of most people.
And
I
you
would
can
say,
see
well, that has certainly come to fruition. I think it has reached its apex in the 20 teens, as our kids would say, to the 2020 arena. Never have we really seen such staunchly polarized discussions. But I want to emphasize something very, very important, and I think we've lost sight of this. Perry, in one of our conversations, I talked about the fact that, I wasn't born in this country, and I became a citizen late in my life, and that my 74-year-old mother became a U.S. citizen at 74 before I was a citizen. And when I looked at, and I was always a decent student of history and politics and so forth, but after gaining citizenship and in that process, reviewing the Constitution and reviewing the preamble, I sat back and I said, are we really behaving as Americans dedicated to this country? Or are we being dedicated to institutions within America that are divisive? When your party comes before the country, you're no longer an American. When your discussions are contrary or antithetical to what it is that serves the country best, you're no longer an American. And it's extremely arrogant, it is extremely short-sighted, and it is extremely moronic for anyone who thinks that they are serving America by being so staunchly in tune with some sub-institution that it undermines the very fabric of this country and begins to rip it apart. That is not American. When we see government officials, again, not putting the country first, then we've got a big problem. And Perry, what you said just kind of triggered me there, and I know you wanted to say something, forgive me. But when you talked about what a better way to destroy a country than from the inside out, that is a perfect assessment. Forgive me, the countries that many people would say traditionally are our enemies, okay, from the outside. What better way, as you said, to bring down this lion of a country, this young developing thing, than to seed dissension, than to seed controversy. And while we're being so enamored with being right and with finally getting at those people and finally getting back at those people and putting these people in their place and protesting these folks, all we see is a crumbling of the infrastructure of what it is that makes us a great country. United we stand, divided we fall. And people are not paying attention to that.
Mm-hmm.
They still think that us, you, them, whomever is the way to go. That's how the fear is being seeded. And all that is bringing down or breaking down the foundation of this country. And anything, people should be saying, anything that creates division in this country is wrong and is not for our future. It doesn't matter if you're a blue-collar worker, a white-collar worker, if you're from rural America, if you're from New York City, California, it makes no difference. What starts negatively is going to impact the entire country, including you, negatively, and will bring this down. And then it'll be interesting to see who's sitting back to take up the pieces. It'll be the people that we would normally consider, or countries that we would normally consider to have been our enemies, who just planted the right seeds to watch discontent bring down the United States of America. Perry, you're going to say something.
Yeah, which is how it's happened historically in other powerful nations. You know, I mean, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire is a good example.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of similarities there. Some historians would argue that, but I think there's a lot of, you know, strong similarities that can be made between the two empires. I think that, you know, when people talk about, you know, when, you know, the Supreme Court justices talk about the originalist idea was for a country where there's cooperation in the legislature.
Mm.
So for people that talk about, you know, affiliations with, you know, the originalists in the founding of the country, where's the cooperation? Where's the compromise, which was the basis of the country in the first place? We're so far away from that now. And then, of course, what this does from a COVID standpoint now is it puts people in a place where they're not even able to hear the scientific information about what they need to do to protect themselves and their families. They're seeing these dramatically polarized presentations of what they're supposed to do. So if you think about the stress that the American public is under, we have this tremendous political stress and uncertainty. So there's fear. Then we have this underlying fear about the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So people, and then the individual fears of my children, their education, my parents, and, you know, their state, and maybe I can't even access them because of where they're at, you know, because of the restrictions. And you can see that, you know, where this just is going to push people is into this emotional place, a place of fear. And what we have to try to do is give people an understanding, and this is really what happens in therapy. You just try to give people, you know, some help in seeing this is what's going on, this is what you're doing, this is what we all do when we're under stress. And what we have to do is we have to work to elevate ourselves. We have to work to transform that. We don't want to stay in this place. And that applies to us individually and us as a nation and within our families. So, but it's the work that we do within ourselves that begin the transformative process. And so if we can move out of fear and into a state that even surpasses reasoning and move into a state that moves into compassion. And through compassion, now what we have is an expansion of consciousness. From I, me, mine, my family, my political party, whatever it is, to this expansion of consciousness that we're all fundamentally the same. We're all brothers and sisters of the country. We're all brothers and sisters of the planet. And we all have to treat each other in this kind and loving way. And it's the foundation of every spiritual teaching. And what's so fascinating is that we can delude ourselves into thinking, even if we're firmly established within a spiritual tradition, that mine's better than yours. And it's the exact same problem over again. So what we have now is an opportunity, because we've had order in our lives for the most part. And over these past few years, and particularly with COVID, we've had a great period of disorder. In complexity theory, they would call it chaos. But I would really prefer to use disorder because chaos is really kind of triggering. But through disorder is where a reordering can occur.
Mm-hmm.
And if we
Yeah.
look at historically, it's only been when disorder occurs that a reordering does occur. And reordering can go in two directions. It can go up or down. And it's up for us to be doing the work within ourselves, within our families, within our communities, within our world, to do everything that we can, that this disorder results in a higher reordering, not a lower one.
We sit at a great point of decision making as a nation. In that concept of reordering, there are basically two ways in which this is going to go, two potentials. And we can either move towards the creation of what is better, really, for the entire country, or not. Let's look at something. Let's ask some very simple questions. Whatever side of any spectrum you fall on, where is anyone going? The people you don't like, are they really leaving? Is this election going to change the population? Is all of a sudden a whole group, a nation of people going to leave? No, they're not. What's happening? More and more individuals are coming into the country. It doesn't matter how much immigration regulation there is. They're still going to be here. Populations are still growing. So you can play the game of, well, keeping a sort of a segregated mind, if you will, which means you constantly live in fear and you constantly live with stereotypes and you constantly live with assumptions, or do something a little bit different. Life is easier when you don't have fear. So people who might watch this discussion sitting there saying, well, what's a psychologist, this Perry Passaro guy, and that doctor, the alternative dude, Mensah, and his buddy, DJ Wells, you know, what does this have to do with COVID? What does this have to do with science?
I'm forever the sidekick.
Sidekick, okay. Sky High, love the movie. When we're looking at these things, it means that we're all living at a level of stress. And during this particular time, we know for a fact stress is up because of everything going on in the world, the fires, the pestilence, the plague, everything. So when there's not this scenario of all these crazy things happening in the world, but now we still sit there and we live with fear, as Dr. Passaro pointed out, as Perry pointed out at the beginning here. Live with fear, your stress hormones are elevated. That leads you to an increased risk of heart disease, an increased risk of therefore hypertension, an increased risk of stroke. All that worry, all those stress hormones negatively impact the human body. Your capacity for thriving, let alone surviving, is decreased. In other words, our own perceptions, and Perry, correct me here, but our own perceptions can literally shift our mortality, or at least the experience of a life that should be fully lived with joy. And as opposed to that, we're harboring anger, resentment, rage. I've seen individuals angry with their own family members for 40, 50 years and experience constant GI tract problems, the nervous stomach, the alternating constipation, diarrhea, the fear-based situations. And when confronted with those pieces, and I literally said to one young lady, I said, listen, you've never forgiven your brother for what it is that's happened here. And she said, I don't know, I'm having a hard time with that. And I said, you've been having a hard time with that for 40 years? I said, and you wonder why you have bowel trouble that now leads to your anxiety and then your depression and your ongoing state of unhappiness? I said, this can't be allowed to continue. So in our conversations, let's ask a very interesting question. What if you imagine that which you A, detest the most, B, fear the most, and then imagine your world if that were gone? Take a moment and think about that. If you didn't fear that person, if you didn't fear that group, if you didn't fear the economy, if you didn't fear some other country, think about how much more peaceful you would be. Think about how much easier, in many respects, moving through life would be. There's a time for danger and there's a time for calm. We talk about pyrrole disorder, a disorder of stress intolerance, where there's a molecule that changes its shape and it now steals zinc and vitamin B6 from your body. And as a result, you go into this fight or flight mode, short fuse. I call it the Bruce Banner Incredible Hulk syndrome. There's a time for that. That is a protective mechanism. But when there's no active danger and you still live in this stressful world, those molecules rise and you continue to now experience a deficit, even in neurotransmitter activity. Your brain can't function properly because the chemistries that allow your nerves to talk to each other, they just aren't there. So now that begins to have an effect on your body and your perception. Okay? And you're not living the life you really should be. What would it be like, Perry, to have a life without fear? Can you share with us what that might look like?
Well,
Sure.
Sounds like a question, but let's talk about that.
Can I jump in real quick here before you answer that question, Perry? Just also a confirmation from you, Dr. Mensah, and I use the formal term purposefully here. Increased stress also lowers your immunity, correct? And
Absolutely.
and so during this time of COVID infection danger, then being more stressful also puts you at risk that way as well.
Thank you, Dr. Wells. You're absolutely correct. It does. And this is what we don't recognize. Everything is connected. It really is. And Perry, just before we talk about the idea of what life would be like without fear, I always tell the story about how my nieces did this test for Ancestry.com, looking at genetic inheritance and so forth. And it inadvertently prompted me to do the same. And when I look at all the individuals who share my DNA, there's no way on God's green planet that I can possibly have an earnest distaste for any particular culture. I have found out, enjoy this one, I am Hebrew, okay? I am Scandinavian, I'm European, I am Scottish. I'm not wearing a kilt today, I promise you. I am, of course, predominantly West African, but I literally saw the people who share my DNA. They show you little pictures of folks all over the globe. I said, there's no way on earth that I can possibly harbor resentment to these folks, because if I did that, I'd be harboring resentment to myself. And that's not going away. So you have a choice. You can continue to be mired in preconceptions and rage and so forth, but it's a waste of time. Is that really how we want to spend our time on this earth, Perry? Is that really leading a life?
It's such a great point. It's such a wonderful example of what I was trying to say, this idea that we're really all one.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this notion of individuality which creates our problems. And that's the perfect example, genetically. When you live in fear, you live in constant judgment. And it's an instantaneous judgment. Just watch it. This person's good, this person's bad. I walk past his house, he has this sign up, I automatically don't like him. This guy has this sign up, I automatically like him. When you're in fear, you're constantly judging. And when you're judging, there's no room for anything else. And what you do is you go through life confirming what you believe. You're looking for evidence that confirms what you believe, and you ignore any and all evidence that contradicts you. That's what the world looks like when you're in fear. I'd say that's a pretty good example of how our world looks right now.
Perry, how do we move away from that?
Sure.
How do we take that?
And,
Yeah, it's understanding. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say we've actually just had one person send in a question that asked exactly that, and
Oh, good.
specific, and this is a great point. Not only how do we move past fear, but how do we move past fear when both sides of the political spectrum tell us that the world's about to end if the other party gets elected?
Right, right. The first thing we have to do is we have to realize what's going on. We have to, because if you think about what our brain does, most of what our brain does is habitual, it's automatic. And so if we can see that, oh my gosh, I'm habitually kind of going through the world in this way, confirming my ideas about this, denying anything along those lines, I'm not present and available, I'm not listening, I'm not here. I can share something that might be helpful with, oh, but you're going to have to allow me to share it, DJ. But I can share something that I think could be helpful to people.
I think you should have screen share capabilities.
Host disabled attendee share meeting.
Let me see what I can do here.
Okay. So I think that there's a methodology that, that our listeners can think about of how do I get out of this? Well, the first thing is understanding that we're in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so while you're working on that, let me know when you think you have it. And so when we have an awareness of what's going on, it's a shocking realization because we really believe that we're thinking and making really sound decisions all the time. But if you look at the data, we're just going through life in a very habitual way, confirming what we already believe.
I think I've got it open here.
Okay, great. Let me try. Not yet.
Oh, well.
That's okay. It's not a big deal. I just thought it'd be easier. I'm kind of a visual learner.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can move into this place of accepting that that's what's going on with us, and that's what's really going on with everyone. And then the trick is, acceptance doesn't mean I'm going to give up. Acceptance means now I'm going to move into this place of making a commitment to live by my values. And my values, and for most people, are not about judging other people before I know them.
Mm.
My values are generally rooted in my religious tradition. And if I'm not a spiritual person, I'm still a moral and ethical person. So I'm going to live by my values. If people were really living by their values, would we be having the kind of interactions that we're having with one another today?
Mm. Good point.
Outstanding.
Good point.
I do think I've figured out the way to open that up if you still want to try and share.
Oh yeah, please, that'd be great. Oh yeah, there it is. Awesome. So can I do desktop? And let's see if this works.
We're slaves to the technology, people.
Does that come up? Can you see that?
Yep, we've got it.
Oh, perfect. This is a wonderful model that I've talked a little bit about before. It's based upon the work primarily of a guy named Steve Hayes at the University of Nevada at Reno. He's a brilliant guy. And what he's really done, and this is a very empirically based form of cognitive therapy. So if you see, what I talked about here is acceptance, which we've talked about. Okay, I kind of see what I'm doing. This is my part of it. Not that other people aren't doing it too, but I can't change them. I can only change myself. And then making this committed action to live by my values. And if you look at in the center of this, it's all based around this idea of psychological flexibility. It's getting out of our stuck patterns and really being open to one another. It doesn't mean that we necessarily agree with them, but it does mean that we still treat them with respect. And this is this process of making a committed change to a behavior. When people are saying that the world is, going to completely collapse in this moment, the most important thing we have to remember is the more we can stay in the present moment, the more flexible we can be, the more we can live by our values, the more we can accept the challenges that we have. Now we're going to be in a place of making much better decisions. So I think this is a way for all of us, and particularly for the listeners, to think about, okay, now I have kind of a roadmap, and all of this fits because these are all things that I can do without a lot of external training. I can remember these principles. I can implement these in my home and in my work and in my life.
Perry, can you comment a little bit about diffusion?
Of course.
What does that mean to you? What does that mean for the rest of us? I think that's a very not paid attention to term a lot.
Sure, absolutely. Diffusion is recognizing when we're stuck and then getting unstuck. It's a core principle of this cognitive flexibility. So we get fused all the time with our thoughts, with our emotions, with our sensations. We get fused. Diffusion is the process of getting ourselves unstuck. And one of the ways that you do that is coming right across here and looking at values.
Mm.
If I'm really stuck and I'm really in this place of judgment, for example, and fear, is that really living by my values? And when people can see that difference, when they can see, you know, I'm really not living by my values, it creates a great deal of cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
And most people, you know, want to live by their values. When we operate from a spiritual standpoint, and if we say that everyone is inherently good, everyone is inherently good, that's their true divine nature. Then when we can move back that way, we might say, well, I don't particularly like their behavior right now, but if I can look at them fundamentally in this way that's aligned to my spiritual values, that everyone is inherently good, then look at how that can diffuse our hatred towards one another.
Now, Perry, you used the term that many people might not be familiar with, cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
We use that in sociology, we use that in psychology and in medicine, but what does that mean for the average person?
It's the ability to see that I'm not that I'm stuck in a pattern, and I'm just now getting the picture of the dissonance between it. So a simple example would be, if I'm a person of faith and I've been taught in faith to love my enemies, and I'm over here in this place of, you know, judging others and condemning them within my own mind and maybe verbally, am I living by the teachings of my faith? That is the creation of cognitive dissonance. And when people own that, it allows them to diffuse.
Well, that's if people own that, Perry, that's a dangerous thing you're talking about. Actually self-reflecting. That means kind of thinking and not emoting. It means taking a step out of ourselves. That's hugely dangerous, Perry.
And the danger is where the hope is, because what we're doing now clearly is not working.
I want to share a personal story about judgment. So, and Mr. Wells would kind of know this, but you know, my first year of college, we lived in thematic colleges, residential colleges within our institution. So our dorms were thematic. So I lived in the International Studies Residential College, and Mr. Wells actually lived in the Communication Residential College next door. But in our first year, we had, of course, our little groups, our little cliques where people hung out and so forth. But at the end of the year, something interesting happened. You had to have points to come back to the dorm, and you know, you didn't always have full control over where you're going to live within the dorm. And each suite was designed to house a very particular interest, such as a French language or a Russian study or something along those lines. Well, there was a young man who would hang out in his clique, and I hung out in mine, and we were of different ethnic backgrounds, although the entire dorm was ethnically designed to be international. We didn't like each other too much, very honest. We actually thought very poorly of the other person, not for any particular reasons. We had never spoken. We had never interacted. We had no reason to. He used to walk around in this long green coat And I thought he was a druggie, quite honestly. I thought he just hung out with druggy people and did druggy things and was a druggy type. And I don't remember what he thought of me, conveniently so. But something very interesting happened. We found out at the end of the year that we were going to be suite mates, meaning we were going to be living within the same 5 to 6 room area where we shared a common living space, where the suite couches were and the table and maybe a television and that kind of a thing. And so it's very interesting because we independently came up with the same thought. I'm going to have to live with this guy in my suite every single day. Maybe I should actually find out what he's really about. And it's funny because we literally broached each other about the same time and said, you know what? We're going to be living with each other next year. You know, why don't we just have a conversation and get to know each other? And Mr. Wells knows my friend's name was DB, initials, right? And we sat down and talked for 2.5 hours, starting at 11 p.m. college time. And we talked until 1:30. And we were blown away that all the preconceptions we had about the other person were totally wrong. Not only that, we had great commonalities, and we were so excited by the future prospect of living in the same suite the next year that we were saddened that the school year was almost over and we'd be each returning home. So when we had this lovely conversation, so much changed for us, and quite literally, he became one of my best buddies in college, and talking all the time. It was so amazing. When we came back to school 2 years later, I was staying off campus, and no easy route to get there, buses or anything like that. And this guy walked into my dorm, and I looked at him and said, "DB, what are you doing here? We're a mile away from the campus." He said, "Al, I came to see you." I said, "Did you bring your car?" He said, "No, I walked." I said, "You walked 1.5 miles to see me?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "But I didn't tell you I was going to be here. How did you know I was going to be here at this time before school begins?" Perry, the most amazing, I never forgot it, words I'd ever heard. He said, "I didn't know, Albert. I took a chance. I took a chance that I might see you here and now. And so I walked 1.5 miles for us just to hang out." And that was one of the most touching things I'd ever heard. This is a European American who took a chance because somebody that he had a preconception about, and it was mutual. We didn't like each other back in that freshman year. We became awesome buddies with so many commonalities, it wasn't even funny. So many ideas, our jokes, our humor, our interest. They were all in so much alignment. But if we hadn't taken the opportunity to realize we're going to be in the same space no matter what, and say, how about we actually take a moment to get to know each other, we would have lost out on an amazing friendship. Absolutely amazing. I wanted to share that story because to me, I think that what really depicts the important things in life. You can't sit down and deal with what you think is going on. You've got to sometimes really find out, especially when it comes to people, because those preconceived notions, and it wasn't because he was white or I was black or somebody else was green. It was because I didn't like the way he was walking around the place and how he dressed. Okay. It gave me a certain preconception that was totally wrong. And this is all true. Mr. Wells will verify this. Okay. It was a matter of being open and removing or diffusing the situation because we didn't want to have the stress of having to deal with somebody we didn't know or like the next year in our dorm. So I shared that story for a reason. And Mr. Wells, you want to say something?
Well, I just want to point out, Perry, you had indicated that that your time was a little bit limited today, and so we really appreciate the time that you've spent with us. And we're going to have to wrap things up here in just a few minutes. But I know that there was a very specific resource that you wanted to share with folks, and we're not going to have a chance to play it on this webinar today, but certainly we're going to include a link to it. So I wanted you to describe that resource so that we can
That'd be great.
with our viewers.
That'd be great. So there will be a resource available through Mensah Medical that comes from our website. We have a number of meditations that are available that are free to access. This is a meditation on the idea of expanding love, which we certainly need in this world. And so it's about 6 minutes. It's a guided meditation. My wife actually guided it, so it's her voice that you'll hear. And so it's something that for those of you that may have a meditation practice, may be helpful if you haven't started one. That would be an introduction, and one you could certainly use more than once. And then I would imagine, DJ, you could have a link to our website to where our meditations are. If people are interested in that, that would be available.
Absolutely.
The one thing that I wanted to say, in closing, if it's okay, is that there are two people that have had the most written about them in the history of the world. The first is Jesus Christ, and the second is Abraham Lincoln. And if you think about Abraham Lincoln, he's the example of what we were talking about today. 750,000 casualties in the Civil War. And this was a man who was nothing but love and compassion. He executed the war at the terrible cost, but he never fluctuated from his values. And it's why politicians today still cite him and read his speeches, because no one has ever been able to emulate him. But if you think about his second inaugural, to forgive everyone, to bind up the nation's wounds with malice towards none, with humility towards all. We're all in the same country, and now we need to come back together and work together. Even though there were strong divisions within the country, he was working to bring the country back together. When you sit and think about that for a minute, watch within yourself where you connect and where you resonate with that idea. It's because Lincoln tapped into our higher selves, the angels of our better nature. Compare that to where we are now, with malice towards all, with humility towards none, with no forgiveness, no kindness. That is really where we can choose. Are we going to listen to the angels of our higher nature or our lower nature? That's where we are. Those are the decisions that we have to make.
Barry, we're going to have a second part to this straight talk conversation, as we wanted to term it before. And when we do this again next time, I want us to start from this point of healing. Stories are great, they're true. Concept is wonderful. But we need to move through the process about how we need to not only visualize, but actualize that change within ourselves that allows us to move to the calling, that hearing of the wonderful angelic pitch that you just sort of described. So that's where I want us to pick up next time. Mr. Wells, were there any conversations that we need to have before we move on and give Dr. Passaro, who he's given us so much great time here, and thank you for your wisdom, Perry, and your knowledge. I know you're very busy and didn't have a lot of time today, but you kind of squeezed this thing in here. You squeezed it in for us. So, Mr. Wells, is there anything that you want to ask Dr. Passaro before he leaves?
Nothing that we need to ask. Just want to point out to all of our viewers that the that the meditation that Dr. Passaro just mentioned, we'll have a link to it, of course, on the Mensah Medical website, but also when you go to YouTube, if you want to rewatch all of this great wisdom, we will have it available later on this evening on the Mensah Medical channel on YouTube. And we will include in the notes section of that video, in the description section of that video, the link to this meditation that Dr. Passaro has mentioned, and links to his website as well, so that you can find those other guided meditations as well. And then also a reminder that later on this evening or tomorrow, there will also be links to all of this stuff available on the Mensah Medical Facebook page. So we encourage you to reach out to friends and family. If this conversation has moved you, then share it with your friends and family. Let them know that it is available via YouTube, via Facebook. You can find links to it so that you can share this information with other folks that need to hear it. To that end, any other closing thoughts from either of you? Otherwise, we'll go ahead and wrap this up.
None other than, don't be jealous, Mr. Wells, you're still my good buddy.
Again, sidekick forever. It's the mantle that I must wear. Dr. Passaro, thank you so much for your time. Dr. Mensah, as always, thank you for yours. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us. We look forward to continuing this conversation and several others, and we will see you again next week. Thank you so much.
Wells. Thank you, Perry.
You bet. Thank you, Albert. Thank you, DJ.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.